Last week we had a narrative that was actually it's pretty easy to follow it. I was reminded that last week that Jesus was a great storyteller. Well, we have in our Bible, we not only have a manual about end times, and though there are tough times, and though there are times that seem to have gotten everybody's attention, there's this resurgence of everybody wanting to know when the end of the world is. So there's a resurgence of biblical prophecy. So it seems like everybody wants to chime in. And there are some voices that are pretty accurate. There are some folks that I listen to, that I read after. And I found myself doing something that I haven't done lately, and I found myself reading and listening to somebody that I don't agree with. And the reason I did that is because I thought, I ought to at least be able to give attention to something and then to take the Bible and see. It's called hermeneutics, by the way. When you take the Bible and you cross-reference the Bible with the Bible, that's hermeneutics. And so that's what I found myself doing a little bit of. Nebuchadnezzar, we found him last week. I left you with a little bit of a cliffhanger, didn't I? I told you that here is the most powerful man in all of the world, someone that was feared. I mean, this guy could hack you up into pieces. He could burn your house. Your house could turn into a dunghill. But this is a man that we left him last week crawling around on all fours, eating grass. Now, I didn't go into great detail because there was so much more that I could say about that, and I didn't want to go too long, but I wanted you to at least have an idea as to where we're headed. I want to read two things to you to start off this morning. We've looked at Nebuchadnezzar's dream and the image, and we're actually in that section prophetically where we examine the 10 toes. A podiatrist, I am not, but a Bible scholar, I hope that I am. I want to read the declaration of Nebuchadnezzar first. And you're going to find that in chapter 3. And this is only after the dream has been interpreted. And I've already told you, when you look at Nebuchadnezzar, he's quite a character. Somewhat of a genius militarily, economically, I think scientifically. We're going to see that. But he was beside himself. He had a dream that he couldn't interpret. In fact, nobody could tell him the dream or interpret. So that's where Daniel came in. After Daniel gave him the interpretation, this is what he said about that. Therefore, I make a decree. They're real big about that sort of thing there in Babylon. It goes back to the law of the Medes and the Persians, that every people, nation, and language would speak anything amiss the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut into pieces. There he goes again, threatening people that he's never met. If you don't follow the God of Daniel, I'm going to cut you into little pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Now, do you believe him? At that point, I've got to go, if that's belief, I don't know that I want it. I mean, this guy is semi-serious. He's come a long way from where he's going to cut everybody into pieces, but still. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. And then there's this second dream. I want to read one other thing before I get into that, chapter 4. I want to read to you and to show you the contrast. This is the decree of Darius. After Daniel had spent some time in the lion's den, and that came to that lion's den early in the morning and said, Daniel, as the Lord God lives, are you still there? And he said, O king, live forever. The lions did me no harm. The angel of the Lord shut their mouths. And he had the mane of one for a bed and the paw of another for a pillow. I don't know. But he came out of that, and Darius believed that he is the Most High God. Well, here's his decree, verse 26 of chapter 6. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and steadfast forever, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Do you see the contrast? Do you see the difference in those two men and their decrees? Well, in chapter 4, we've got 25, 30 years later. And it is a narrative. It is the personal testimony of Nebuchadnezzar. And if you understand that even though the first 6 chapters are done chronologically, I suggested that you look at this a little differently. Because not every I and not every T theologically is going to be dotted correctly. And some people have a problem with that. They have a problem with those little g's and those s's on the ends of God. But I don't. Because I think we understand that as it is written, so shall it be. What I mean by that is, though Nebuchadnezzar was not an inspired writer, Daniel was. And so, did he edit any of the king's testimony? I don't believe that he did. I believe that as we read it like it was given to us to read. This is a man who had all that power, but yet didn't know God. And he didn't realize where that power came from. Now, this is a manual for present-day leadership. It's a great manual for teenagers. It's a great manual for young parents. It's a great manual for leaders, for presidents, for emperors, for kings. We've gotten away from that a little bit. We have forgotten where power comes from. We have forgotten who is actually sovereign. And sovereignty and glory belong to the Lord. And I looked at several passages, and I think it suffices to say that when we give God the glory, he certainly deserves it. He is awesome. Who could even begin to take the glory away from God? The heavens are his home, and the earth is his footstool. And so Nebuchadnezzar, in the first 3 verses, he's got me. I'm hooked. I'm thinking, okay, this guy went from loving himself, worshiping himself, to worshiping Daniel. Now, you remember whenever we read that, I said, that's a problem. That's a problem when you worship another man. And then finally, he worships the very kingdom that he built. So in doing so, he comes to a place where God deals with him. Now, we have an image of him walking around what he may have looked at or looked like after 7 years of being a beast in the field. His hair grew long. His nails grew like bird's claws. They curled. He wasn't easy to look at, let alone be around. And you might say, well, why did it come to that? Well, let's find out. When we begin to look at the testimony, we recognize that there are some players that are still the same. The magicians, the soothsayers, the Chaldeans. This time, the king told them the dream, but they still couldn't interpret the dream. So verse 8 says, but at last came Daniel. God's timing is always perfect. He doesn't show up on our time schedule, but he shows up on his own. So Daniel shows up at last. And the king is giving a testimony, and there, like I said before, and I just reiterate this so that when I come to those verses, you won't cringe. You won't go, ooh. Because the fact of the matter is, this guy is not a theological scholar at this point. He is relaying to you how he became a believer of Yahweh. And so his words may not be exactly like we would say them, but then again, none of us, when asked to give a personal testimony, none of us can truly express. We try through song, through the praise and the worship of God. We try to give him the glory. We try to say, this is what I was, this is what I came from. But most of us are not theologians. We're not really sure if the words are right. I like what the blind man said. when Jesus healed him. And then again brought they the man that was blind, and they said unto him, Give God the glory, for we know that this man's a sinner. And he answered and he said unto them, Whether he be a sinner I know not, but one thing I do know is where I was blind, now I see. That's his testimony. I think I mentioned to you I have a problem sometimes with celebrities and sports figures that say they know God. Sometimes they may say that out of convenience or because it's what's expected out of them. I read the testimony of George Foreman, and I was a little skeptical at first. This is a guy that quit boxing to become a preacher. His testimony is such that only 2 words describe his testimony. He came out of a defeat, I believe it was Jimmy Young, and he sat on a table after being convicted over and over and over again, and he came out with 2 words. His testimony, the summation of his testimony, are 2 words. I believe. For with the heart man believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made. We agree with God. We agree with God that he sent his son Jesus to die for us. And so this man's testimony is a little bit longer than I believe. But when you get right down to it, there's more at stake here than just this king's testimony. It is an expose on how leaders should lead kingdoms, how presidents should lead, how kings should lead, how those that have been given such authority ought to lead. And when we recognize that through literature and through movies and all the things that are thrown us, when a leader abuses his privilege, it infuriates most of us. Most of us get a little angry. Well, here he is, and he's given his testimony. So Daniel comes in at the last, and he says, his name is Belteshazzar. That tells me right away, by calling him by his Babylonian name, the first part of that name is Bel. They used to, he worshiped, if you want to call it that, this god called Bel. Sometimes we would look at it as Baal or Baal. And so he named him. He renamed Daniel Belteshazzar. According to the name of my God, see? And in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. I already went over that with you. It's a little g, it's an S. He may not be saying it exactly the way we want him to, but then again, he's telling us his story. He doesn't have to have it exactly right. Now, there are some that would say that, and I looked it up, and it's true, it could have been translated singular, God. And where did he get that idea? I'm going to say from watching Daniel, and that's why that song was so meaningful last week. May those that come behind us find us faithful. For 25 to 30 years, this king has been watching Daniel. And the conclusion is that Daniel's God is holy. When men make gods, they make them after themselves. And they are pagan, and they are immoral, and they serve nothing but humanity. That's what an idol is. And America has her idols. In fact, the world has her idols. And we don't even need to go into that. So, there you have it, the little g and the little s. And so, I told him this dream. O Belteshazzar, master of the magicians. Once again, there are some that interpret that as men of science and intelligence and not hocus pocus, but the fact of the matter is they're magicians in your Bible. And by the way, I listened to a King James purist last week, and I am perfectly content with that word in my Bible. Once again, I recognize that this is the story of a man who doesn't have it all. He didn't study Schaeffer's systematic theology before he gave his testimony. So I don't expect him to necessarily get it right yet. So he says, I know that in you dwells the spirit of the holy gods. No secret troubles you. You tell me the visions of my dream that I have seen and the interpretation thereof. Thus were the visions of my head in my bed I saw, and behold, and here it is, and we'll take the time to read it. I saw and behold a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. And the tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven, and the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. That's a big tree. Yes? That's quite a tree. The leaves thereof were fair, and the fruit thereof much. And it was meat for everyone, for all. And the beasts of the field had shade under it, shadow under it. The fowls of the heavens dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all flesh was fed of it. And I saw in the vision of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher and a holy one came down from heaven. That's an angel. Angels are considered messengers, servants of the Most High. And more than likely, that is who that was. I can't dogmatically say it, but I'm pretty sure it was an angel, a messenger. So this messenger comes down from heaven, and he cried aloud, and he said, cut the tree down. Cut it down. Hew it down. Cut off the branches. Shake off the leaf. Scatter his fruit. Let the beasts get away from under it, and the fowls from its branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots in the earth. Stop right there. It's a tree. And now is that a personal pronoun? His. He uses the word his. That tells me right away, he's talking about a man. He's not talking about a physical tree. He's talking about a man. Now we know it because we've got our Bible. But how'd you like this to be thrown at you, impromptu? Tell me what this means. So Daniel's listening. He's listening. Leave the stump of his roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass. More than likely, that's a fence. Some type of a barrier around him. And let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. That's 7 years. And actually, we could get that from the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel and the book of Ezekiel that speak of the 70th week of Daniel and the 7 years of tribulation, 3.5 years of peaceful tribulation, and then 3.5 years of hell breaking loose on earth. And I'm excited to get into that because I found some things out about Gog and Magog that might or might not interest you. But here we go. This, and by the way, if you want to take in your Bible and you want to put a little asterisk, there are at least 4 to 5 verses that spell out what the theme of this chapter is about. And here's one of them. This matter is by decree of the watchers, the angels, the heavenly decree, and the demand by the word of the holy ones. This isn't my word. This is their word. And he identifies that, and he tells Daniel that, and that then to the intent that the living may know, and here is the theme of this chapter. Underline it. That the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men. That's the theme of this chapter. And it takes God doing a work in the life of Nebuchadnezzar to prove it to not only himself, but to all of Babylon and to the rest of the world. We could use a refresher course in that in the White House. We could use a refresher course of that anywhere there's a kingdom and a dictator, a king, or a president. You think you rule, but God has given you that rule. Don't abuse it. And that is the theme of the chapter right there. You must know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and he giveth to whomsoever he will, and he setteth up over even the basest of men. God puts up some, and he tears down others. God does that. He is sovereign. And we've all seen medieval shows and films where the king has a God complex, and he thinks of himself as the Most High God. What a mistake. You know, I got this title from an old Chuck Swindoll message on Saul, How the Mighty Are Fallen. You believe your own press release. You believe so much that you're in charge and that you're over, that no one can tell you anything, no one can suggest anything, because after all, you know it all. You know, at one point, Samuel couldn't understand why God would reject Saul. And then he probably committed one of the grossest trespasses that a king could. He went to a witch. He went to a witch to seek advice. And God told Samuel, now this is a paraphrase, but I like the way I'm doing it. He told Samuel, you need to get over it, but I'm rejecting him. I'm rejecting him as king. Get over it. You're going to anoint another. And we all know that that was David, that he would anoint. So there it is. That's the theme of the book. This dream I, Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now thou, O Belteshazzar, declare the interpretation of, for as much as all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make it known unto me, the interpretation, but thou art able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in thee. There it is again. Now, I've got several notes, and I probably won't get to them, but here we go anyway. You know, probably one of the greatest sins that we can commit is the sin of pride. Proverbs 16:18 says that pride goeth before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. Proverbs 11:2 says that it is a shame when men are lifted up by pride. Proverbs 15:25, a proud look God rejects. James 4 says this, God resists the proud, and he gives grace to the humble. Don't name him, but when is the last time that you perceived humility in one of our presidents? Now, I have somebody in my mind, but I'm not going to tell you who it is. It may have been an act. I don't think it was. Someone that actually declared God as supreme, as sovereign. When's the last time you had any leader of any nation give glory to God? I didn't say Allah now. I said God. Those are not the same. That's a whole other story, but they're not. So here's Belshazzar. Here's Daniel. And this is where I believe the Spirit of God has him to write this down. Then Daniel, whose name was Belshazzar, was astonished for an hour. Well, what does that mean? Well, I've read after several commentaries, and some say that he was scared to death. I don't think he was. I mean, this is a guy that's going to go into a lion's den. This is a guy that has, at the very beginning, we've already seen that he purposed in his heart that he wouldn't defile himself with the king's meat. I don't think he's afraid. I think he's afraid for the king. I think that he has such compassion that for 30 years he's been trying to lead a life in front of this guy that would convert him, that would cause him to be merciful and kind and have works of righteousness. But the king is who the king is. And so for about an hour, I don't think he says much. Is he praying? Probably. I don't know if you're standing before this guy. I'm not sure if you're sitting down. I don't know. But I know that he's astonished. And he's not sure what to say, but this is what comes out. He says, though being troubled for about an hour, and his thoughts troubled him, and boy, that you can run away with that, the king spake and said, now Belshazzar, let not the dream, I think the king must have picked up on this, let not the dream or the interpretation thereof trouble thee. Don't let it bother you. Belteshazzar answered and said, My Lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies. Here's what he's saying. I would to God that I could give you the interpretation of the dream and it applied to your enemies. Oh, that tells me something. That tells me the king had enemies. I think a lot of those old boys that he was going to cut into pieces didn't like the king much. And I think I told you last week that I don't believe that Daniel hung out with them. I think Daniel had his duties and he went about his duties. And by the way, did you not know that Daniel, at some point, he was the king's cupbearer? You know what that guy did? He tasted everything the king was going to drink or eat. If somebody was going to poison the king, guess who gets it first? Daniel. So he's saying to the king, I really wish this was an interpretation that applied to your enemies. I think that also it wasn't because he didn't know the interpretation. I think it's because he did know the interpretation. And he's like, oh boy, here we go. Emphasis mine. Here we go. I'm going to have to tell this king what this means. It's not going to be easy, but here we go. I wish I had better news for you, but here it is. The tree that thou sawest, which grew, was strong, whose height reached into the heaven. He almost repeats the dream exact. And thereof to all the earth, whose leaves were fair, and the fruit there much, and it was meat for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and whom the branches, the fowls of heaven, had their habitation. It's you. The same guy who had the dream in the image with a head of gold, where Daniel was able to say, that's you. Now there's this tree. And by the way, I found that it wasn't uncommon to use an example of a tree to give homage to a king. The Pharaoh was considered to be that way. There were other kings that the tree was used as an analogy for a king's greatness, and his branches spread out. So this isn't uncommon. So he says, it's you, O king. You are grown and you have become strong. Remember what started all this? He was taking his ease in his house. He was enjoying being king. There were no wars. There was nothing, as far as he could tell, that should cause him to be anxious, but he dreamt this dream, and now he's troubled. He's afraid. He says, it's you. You've grown, and you have dominion to the ends of the earth. Whereas the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven. Cut the tree down, destroy it, yet leave the stump and the roots thereof in the earth with a band of iron or some type of a fence around it, so that you might be with the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field till 7 times pass over. 7 years. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree. This is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my Lord the King. Some footnotes. There are people, and if you can put that image back of Nebuchadnezzar, there are people that actually believe, lycanthropy is what it's called, that psychologically people believe that they're animals. Lycanthropy is actually something that we're familiar with if you watch horror flicks. It's the belief that you're turning into a werewolf. Psychiatrists have taken that to an extreme, and they begin to evaluate and interpret that kind of behavior, and they call it schizophrenia. They give it all kinds of names. But in this case, it's called boanthropy. Boanthropy, the belief that you're turning into a cow. So, what I did is I researched that. Has there ever been in history anyone that ever thought they were turning into a cow? Yes. In fact, some leaders, some were Buddhists, there's one guy in 1943 he actually believed he was a cow. And he was diagnosed as having boanthropy. So for 6 years, and by the way, from everything I read, this guy was fit as a fiddle. He looked fit. He had a particular speech. He was educated, intelligent. But when he turned, for 6 years, he wandered around the grounds while the other patients were inside. and he ate grass. Eventually, he was cured. So it's not uncommon. Now, I don't give you that information to try to prove the Bible to be correct. I believe it no matter if I could prove it or not. But the fact of the matter is, this guy believed he was an ox. That's what's going to happen to him. Now, here's where you need to really pay attention close, because I think it's awesome. This is what happens. And I'll show you a couple of things here in just a minute. Here's how it's going to go down. Verse 25, that's one of those little, you need to put a little asterisk by that verse. They shall drive thee from men. Who are they? Doesn't say. Most people believe it's a host of heaven. Somebody drives him. Mad. This guy's a nutcase. But not immediately. And that's one of those things that, once again, you have to be careful chronologically as you read your Bible. They don't always go in order. This is just what's going to happen. You're going to drive you from men. Your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as an oxen, and they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven. 7 times it will pass over you. That's 7 years. 7 years. It will pass over you till thou know, till you know that the Most High ruleth the kingdom of men. There it is again. And giveth it to whomsoever he will. You think you're great? It's hard to be humble. I am the greatest. You're the man. Not necessarily. So there's the interpretation of the dream. This is what's going to happen. And whereas they commanded to leave the stump and the tree roots, thy kingdom shall be sure unto thee. I'll explain that in a second. That thou shalt have known that the heavens do rule. God rules. Now just stop right there. Here's what he's saying. You're going to become like a cow. Now, do you think you could stand before that king that threatens to slice and dice you and cut you up into pieces, and you're telling this guy you're going to eat grass, man? And you're going to do it for 7 years. You're going to go nuts. I'm not sure what the reaction was immediately, but here's the deal. I think that those magicians and those soothsayers, and there were some Chaldeans that were going, yeah, maybe. We're going to get this guy. But yet God said his kingdom will be sure. You know who I think was watching over him for 7 years? Daniel. I think those 3 Hebrews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were watching over that king. They couldn't do anything with him, but they're watching over him. If there was an assassination attempt, I think they were there to thwart it. God said, after 7 years, your kingdom will be restored to you. And I believe it was Daniel and those Hebrew boys, the same guys that were slaves, that watched over it. That's just something I believe. I don't know that I can prove it, but I know this. If God said it, that settles it, right? Now, here's his counsel. If the interpretation is not enough, here's the counsel. I tell you what the interpretation means. Now, here's what I suggest you do. Wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee. Break off your sins. Obtain righteousness. That's what he's saying. He said, you need to obtain righteousness. How do you obtain that? Through God, the Most High and Holy One. Break off thy sins. Break off thy sins and break them off then unto righteousness and thine iniquities by showing mercy. Let your works be established. Works of what? Works of righteousness. Have mercy. Show mercy to the poor. Don't be such a hard case. Lighten up a little bit. Let God be reflected in your life and in your words and in your works. That's what he's telling him to do. That it might lengthen your tranquility. What does that mean? So you can still have peace. Now you might think that he just immediately went out and he went mad. No. You want to talk about the patience of God? Let's talk about that for a second. You want to know why God hasn't come back yet? Because he is patient, and he's long-suffering, and he's merciful. For a whole year, that guy had that interpretation. I imagine each day he got up expecting, well, I wonder if today's the day. After a year, does it say a year or almost a year? At the end of 12 months, in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon, he walked. Here's what he was doing. Remember I told you he worshiped himself, he worshiped Daniel, he worships his kingdom. Have you ever heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon? This king had some real architects around him. I don't know if it's one of the 8 wonders of the world, but he's one of the first to invent air conditioning. And he did it by building a mound or a small hill or mountain where he had ferns and trees and palms and greenery, and somehow he put water that trickled down those leaves where the wind would blow across those leaves. And they say he did this for his wife. There's a lot of things I'll do for you, honey, but I don't know about this. And so the wind blowing across the water that trickled down from the leaves produced cool air conditioning. Now, I don't know if you can set that baby to 55, but he had air conditioning. So he's out walking around. He's looking out over the palace, and he's looking out probably over those hanging gardens. He's looking at the gold and the silver and the brass. He's looking at what he's accomplished. And then he says this, and I'm going to wrap this up in just a second. He says this, then the king spake and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? Man, look around, what you see, I did this. And as the words were in the king's mouth, while the word was yet in the king's mouth, there fell a voice. You don't hear that every day. I believe there were probably more people that heard it. But I know he heard it. There is a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken. The kingdom is departed from thee. There it is. Verse 32, put an asterisk. They shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen. 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men, and he did eat grass as an oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven. His hairs were grown out like an eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird claws. That's what 7 years on your all fours will do for you. And apparently he was fenced in, and the only thing that I can say about that is this, that Daniel watched over him. Now, I worked on this, okay? I worked hard on this. The reason we don't fully comprehend this is because we really don't know the enormity of his palace, his empire. We have stories, we have books, we have history, we have a lot of things, but we don't really visualize that. What if this were the President of the United States? And Peggy, I'll be very kind, because I could really have fun with this. What if the President of the United States, this is SS1, that's Secret Service for all you amateurs. This is SS1 with Farmer. Farmer is the code word for president. I'm with Farmer, and we're headed out of the White House now. Well, this is SS2. Well, that's great. What's your 1020? Well, we're out on the White House lawn. Over. Roger that. Well, what is your status? SS1 to SS2. Well, Farmer is on the White House lawn. Pause. Over. Be advised that CNN is here for the interview with the president. How should we proceed? Over. SS2 to SS1, well, I don't know that we'll have to make it another day. The president's out on the lawn eating grass. Over. Not only would this world immediately get a picture of our president on the White House lawn on all fours eating grass, but think about the American people. If you're embarrassed now, think about the embarrassment then. And you'll get a little taste for this king and the rest of the world. Maybe it would take 7 years for news to spread, but I got a feeling that gossip travels a lot faster than truth. So I got a feeling that most of the people knew about this. In fact, they probably could have charged admission. In fact, if this were America and that was our president, somebody would probably get the bright idea and they would charge admission to see this thing. And then there would be the coup that would take over. You know, vice president, re-election, whatever, okay. See, I was kind. I didn't go where I could have gone. But now you get an idea as to the embarrassment to those magicians and soothsayers and his cabinet. And yet you don't find Daniel or the Hebrews being embarrassed by it. I believe they were protecting the king. Because God said, after that 7 years, your kingdom is still with you. I don't know of any place other than in the Bible that could take place, but if God said it, then I believe it. So this is what happens, and then we'll close. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, remember, he's telling you his story. He's giving his testimony. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up my eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me. And I blessed the Most High. And I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. Do I believe that I'll see Nebuchadnezzar in heaven? I do. I've heard some guys say you can't really be dogmatic about that, but I believe one day I'll sit around. I might not get right to him, but I'm going to get around and I'm going to get with Daniel and Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego and Nebuchadnezzar. And I'm going, tell me how that all went down. You know, I want to know. You know, I'm sure I'll be interested in some other things, but I want to know how this all happened. You know, I want you to tell me a story. We're going to have lots of stories to share in heaven. And this is one that I want to sit at the feet of these guys as they tell that story. Because guess what? The end result is the whole point. He is Most High. And his dominion is from everlasting to everlasting. Is there any man, is there any nation that can go up against God? Time out. A precursor to next week. I found out that when the sixth seal is opened, something happens. And let me tell you what happens. The king of the north, the extreme north, not Turkey, not Syria. I looked at every commentary that was written in the 18th and 19th century and early 20th century. Most of those guys believe that Ezekiel knew who Gog and Magog was. I don't. Because it speaks of Israel dwelling in safety. Israel has never dwelt in safety. I'm going to tell you how many wars they've had since 1948 next week. At any rate, this ruler, whoever he may be, whether it be Russia or not, this ruler, Gog, and if you want to be a King James purist, go right ahead. By the time it happens, maybe he's called Gog, I don't know. Hermeneutics dictates that I find out another reference in the Bible where it's mentioned. It's only mentioned one other place. Guess where it's at? Revelation chapter 20. I'll explain that next week. This ruler, he decides to take Jerusalem from the Antichrist. So he mounts an attack and he invades Israel. And God, in one fell swoop, destroys that army, and only a sixth of them remain, so that his name might be declared. Do you know who takes credit for it? Guess. The Antichrist. And there are those that rise up and say, look what that guy did. He must be God. The exact same time that happens, guess what else happens? The sixth seal is opened, and all hell breaks loose. You don't take God's glory from him. And that's for next week. Here, Daniel is in a position to see probably one of the greatest transformations, humanly speaking, that anyone could ever witness. A man, did he get cleaned up? I sure hope so. Did he make a speech? He probably made several. But here's a guy that's, I don't know what he smells like, but I know kind of what he looks like. But his senses come to him, and he declares God to be the most high one, lofty in his dominion. It lasts from generation to generation, and all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, why are you doing that? What are you doing? Really? At the same time, my reason returned unto me. And for the glory of my kingdom, mine honor and brightness returned unto me, and my counselors and my lords sought unto me. Those guys that were probably looking at a way to take over, now they're coming to this guy, Nebuchadnezzar, and they're seeking his advice. It does matter about all those who come behind, what they're going to find. What are we going to leave? I thought about that. When we leave this earth, what will our kids find? And I don't mean trinkets and toys. What evidence will we leave behind that we were here and that we served him faithfully? So I was established in my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added unto me. That's the kind of God we serve. Do you think God made his point? I believe God made his point. But he restored to that king the kingdom. Now, verse 37, make the little asterisks. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase, bring low.